In 76 or 77, one of the years I remember being at Tops, and Denny Corcoran and Bula Power were doing the Ghost of the Theatre Royal. And across in the middle of the sketch came an apparition in a negligee. That changed my whole mind about Tops. I said, I'm sticking at this game. I said, there's something good in this. I eventually married the apparition in the negligee, walking across. And I always thank Denny for that.
Paul O'Brien and Paddy O'Brien. Now, who would ever ask the President of Ireland? Mary Robinson came to the Glassback day one day, and Paul was selling tickets. And he asked Mary Robinson, would you buy a ticket, Mary? By the Tops of the town. Oh, she shook her head and kept going.
Denny and Bula did it. I remember Bula with a big long fur coat on him. They had to have a fresh carnation every time they went on. I never got paid for all them carnations. Daniel Kelly still owes me money for them carnations.
The 1970s had seen the highs and lows of Tops in Waterford. It was a decade which saw legends created and brought unprecedented success on a local and national scale. Nobody could be blamed for thinking this trend would continue in the 80s. It certainly looked that way in the first year of the new decade, where Waterford Banks and Finance were to dominate proceedings. No man is an island, and no one man makes a show, unless he's the irrepressible Dermot Graham. The Waterford News and Star reflected on the local final.
For one man in particular, this 1980 win was a tremendous personal success, and one which was richly deserved. I refer, of course, to Dermot Graham, who produced the Bank show, as well as filling the role of conductor of the orchestra, cast and chorus from the orchestra pit. I can only marvel at the artistry and skill with which Dermot Graham can take a group of amateurs and mould them into a perfectly disciplined team such as this Banks and Finance group turned out to be.
With the arrival of Dermot to the Banks and Finance group, long-serving musical director Des Manahan found himself moving to an onstage role.
I'm Hans Christian Andersen, my pen's like a babbling brook. Permit me to show you, dear sir, my very latest book. Now here's a tale of a simple fool, just glance at the page or two.
When Dermot came in, and Dermot took over then as MD, and I went up on stage then as a guest, which you were allowed in those days then. We did our famous Hans Christian Andersen scene with the ugly duckling and the King's new clothes. They were marvellous. It was a great scene, actually. It won great awards and things.
The 1980 local final saw Banks and Finance opposing Waterford Glass, who were appearing in their 9th consecutive final. Despite a top-class Glass production, the Banks and Dermot were worthy winners and began their march to the gaiety in earnest. Not since 1969 had a Waterford team lost a national final, and hopes were high that the Banks could maintain this record. Eddie Winbury and Dermot Graham's wife Teresa remember the emotive finale to the Banks show.
And that particular night Dermot put in his show, the finale was a wonderful song in which everybody on the show came out dressed in green and white, and at the tail end of it they all had placards, and on the final note of the final song everything came together with a map of the 32 counties of Ireland. The crowd went bananas. This was an emotional thing. At that time, it was when Ireland was going through that phase when we all thought we were going to get the North back the following Friday week or something like that. One of the adjudicators thought we were pandering to the IRA. I mean, how stupid can you get?
One of the adjudicators took exception to that because she didn't understand it. Maeve Ascot, I think. She was the choreographer and she was English. And she thought that was an IRA scene instead of being a peace scene. That was a peace scene where all the pillars of the GPO were blown up. So she took completely the wrong meaning. It was a peace scene with Chris Henchy singing, not a Republican scene, which she took, and she marked that down. And that was the difference. Looking at the adjudicator sheet later on, that was the difference in the two shows.
Irish distillers ran out very narrow winners in the gaiety, with, as Teresa suggests, one adjudicator's score making all the difference. The decade which had started with such high hopes had hit the rocks. Des Manahan remembers what it was like to lose a national final.
It was just a show for us, in that sense. The excitement of getting up there, being on television and getting everyone to record us for when we came home. We could look at ourselves and see what we were like. That was great fun. Disappointment of being beaten, but I don't think we thought we were going to beat. It was Noel MacDonagh's group. They were better dancers than us. We were as good as them musically, comedy-wise, but they were much more polished dancers. And in that sense, they took it away. They deserved to win.
One of the greats who took part in the Banks and Finance show was Eddie Winbury, a member of the comedy team. The comedy team in any Tops show was an enigma.
There was always this thing of the group were together rehearsing. And then there was, in inverted commas, the comedy team. And these were an elite group who rarely came to rehearsal, who rehearsed on their own and just came in at the end and sort of slotted in all their pieces one way or another, you know. And it wasn't just our group, it was every group. There was always the comedy team. Elitist.
Comedy was an integral part of the John Player Tops. Everyone has their own unique memories and, of course, their own favourites.
I've seen many a comedian perform, but Eddie Wimbury just cracks me up. You go away with sore ribs. He's just unbelievable. And Eddie can tell you a joke in the street and you're laughing at it and you're trying to remember it so you can tell it to the next person you meet.
Our problem was comedy. We were saying, how would we win these shows? We were sitting in Bill Martin's pub one night and somebody said, Davy Sutton can do Sid Snot. So I turned around to Davy and said, Davy, how old are you? I think he was 15. Would you have the neck to do that? No bother, Michael. He said, I'll do anything. So down the steps he came in the middle of the stage, dressed as Sid Snot, nutting the curtains on the way down. Told the story about Deirdre and robbing things out of a jeweller shop and the shoe shop in Patrick Street. And by the second night when he was telling this, and before he could open his mouth, Chrissy Madigan and everyone in the gods were calling Deirdre for him. And we knew we were on the road, we were getting there.
Myself and Bola were the best of friends. The 2050 he decided to go with the glass. And nearly broke my heart when he said he was leaving. Anne McGrath, she was a great foil for myself and Bola, and she was a great part of the Ballyassie. She was game for anything.
I'll tell you something, between Bola and Digger, someone had come up with a good ending to it, always a punchline. Me and Butch did Whispering Grass another year. Jesus, it was as good now as you see anywhere.
I was doing a sketch one time down there, and it's about two cowboys. And Curly Lanigan, we had a little fella in the show. Mikey Tobin was his real name. He was smaller than Jimmy Finn. And they were out on the stage, and the scene went, before I kill you, senor, I want to know your name. And he said, Bull. And he said, Bull what? And some fella shouted from the back, bullshit.
In 1981, the Glass regained their local title, defeating Raytex, who were appearing in a final for the first time. Patsy Sheridan took the Best Producers Award for his Raytex production. The Glass reached the national semi-finals in Limerick, but unfortunately were defeated by Jacobs of Dublin. 1982 was a rarity, a local final without the Glass, with the Banks and Finance, again under the guidance of Dermot Graham, defeating Raytex in a keenly contested final. And as Mick Brown reported in the Munster Express, by the early 80s, Tops was becoming ever more competitive.
The usual crop of rumours about the eligibility of some artists to participate are in the air again, but I have no intention of voicing them here. If, however, these rumours have any substance in fact, it seems rather a pity that some shows are expected to stick rigidly to the rules, while others are permitted to ignore them.
Gary Power and Patsy Sheridan recall the thorny question of eligibility.
In those days of Raytex, I do remember the competition was so strict that I remember somebody actually ringing up to know what was my connection with Raytex, that I wasn't in any way connected. I didn't work in the firm. And I remember having to go to Liam Doyle's shop, which is now Centra up in Johns Park, and having to ask Liam to say that I worked there selling Raytex tinfoil. And it was a huge thing, and there was an absolute discrepancy that how did Gary Power get into this show.
So you start a fella for 2 days, and once he was on the payroll, but he only worked for maybe 3 days, but that was part of it. And then there was fellas saying, we have an objection in against you because look at paragraph so-and-so, you have an illegal guy and all this.
So the question remains, did people get jobs because of the Tops? More than 25 years later, it seems the jury is still out.
The story went on about people getting jobs in Waterford Glass in order to be in the show, and that was true, because we met them. Dermot showed that's so-and-so, who got the job in order to appear in the show, and that was 100% true. But of course it helped that Tom Healy, who was in the shows himself, was in charge of personnel.
When anyone was good in another company, we made sure they got a job in Waterford Glass.
How did you get into the glass factory? I saw Tom Healy, he was the personnel officer. I was over with Tom Healy, I said. Yeah, and I suppose this, on the end of the form was, can you act? And he pulled you in right away from tops of the town. No, I think that was a fallacy. But I had to laugh at that. Can you act? And Tom Healy pulled you in and gave you a job.
People only got into Waterford Crystal at that time if they knew somebody. You know what I mean? So because a guy did something in a show for Tops of the Town, and he got into Waterford Crystal. Well, fair dues. Like, at the end of the day, he got a job. You know what I mean? And jobs were jobs. And the way I look at all of that, I'd never down anybody for it, because if I had been involved in Tops of the Town and got a job in Waterford Crystal, I wouldn't have worried about it. I can assure you.
1983 regrettably saw the smallest entry in the history of Waterford Tops. Just 3 teams competed that year: Clover Meats, Banks and Finance, and the newly rebranded Waterford Crystal, who managed to beat off the Banks to take the title. Crystal also captured the Adjudicator's Special Award for a song that was to become one of Waterford's most enduring anthems. Denny and Paul Corcoran take up the story.
I had a scene of Valdurine, Brendan Meyer, Gilbert O'Sullivan, all the great Waterford men. I needed something to finish the scene with. I said, I'll finish it with City of Music.
And he came out in that scene dressed as a very old man with a hat, moustache, an old stick and a top coat on him. It was from the perspective of an old man who was reminiscing about the city in his youth, and that's it. It's written in that form. It's written as an old man thinking back and memories being evoked of years gone by when he was young.
I started in the foundry to write it. It took me a half an hour.
Won't you play a song, Lord?
It was arguably the finest half hour's work Denny had ever put in. City of Music remains a perennial favourite to this day. But if Denny and fellow Tops veterans such as Dermot Graham and Patsy Sheridan still ruled the roost, by 1984 a young producer was getting ready to shake up the Waterford Tops: Michael Grant.
And I remember then looking at what was my first time seeing a Michael Grant show. He was with Clover, and it was called So This Is Show Business, and that was 1984. And they were against a very slick production by the Banks, which had all of the Mac and Mabel theme music, and it was just wonderful costume. Oh boy. And Dermot Graham, when he opened on an opening night, boy, did you see a slick show. But any other show, I always remembered, always kind of moved up. If you had a chance of 3 performances, you moved up. And I remember that Clover show moving up. And I remember well having a ticket for the final, and I remember saying, you know what, that's going to win.
I remember driving down to MacDonagh Road, and in I went to Richie Collins's house, and Richie was there ironing. Very good man to iron, actually, or make tarps. And I said, Richie, you wouldn't join us, I said, in Tops. We need a bit of experience. Oh, I would. Well, okay, I'll come up, he said, and have a look at you. We needed someone to talk over while the rest were singing show business. But that same person then had to come out to do a song, I think it was Ragtime, I'm not sure, after that. So we were up rehearsing anyway in De La Salle in St. Stephen's Street. I was standing in front of the crowd, and I noticed from the side of me eye, Richie was in the corner and he was after taking his trousers off. I was short of blessing myself, I didn't know what was going on. And I could see everybody looking over. And next thing, Richie turns the trousers around and puts it on again. And then he walks out onto the stage. And so I had to stop. I said, stop lads, stop. Richie, I said, what's going on here? I was timing, he says, my change to see could I make it. Now we thought that was the most professional thing we have ever seen in our lives. We were stunned. We were going to win it that year. And actually we did win it that year.
Michael and Clover Meats stunned Waterford by beating the Banks and Finance in the 1984 final. With the Gaiety Theatre closed for renovations that year, Cork Opera House was selected to host the national final for the first time. And as word of mouth spread on the show, Clover went forward to the national stages as red-hot favourites to go all the way to the final. But as Michael Grant remembers, they never made it.
And the reason that didn't make the final, and we were very much tipped to get to the final, and I'll tell you straight out, is that we sang out of tune for the whole semi-final. And we thought we spent the day right. Down on the beach, I was keeping everyone off the drink. I was like Adolf, to making sure nothing went wrong. And I tired everyone out. We went on the stage and everything was moving and we were tired and overexcited, and sure. That was, I remember getting the report, out of tune. So actually a lot of the audience didn't notice. They thought we did very well.
Over the years, adjudicators and the reports were always a hot topic of conversation. Eddie Winbury remembers the atmosphere as an adjudicator stepped up to give his or her verdict.
Now, and I am not exaggerating when I tell you this. If you dropped a sheet of paper on the floor of the theatre aisle, it would have sounded like the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. When you went back to get the adjudication from the adjudicator, they would crucify you. they wouldn't do it in front of the audience, and they'd tell you, that scene is not working for you. Would you not be better taking it out completely? Most of the producers would have listened. An odd one didn't, and suffered as a consequence. And not only did they suffer, but their shows suffered. Now, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to understand that if you don't take it out, you have a problem.
Des Manahan remembers some of the famous adjudicators down through the years.
Sean Cotter, I think, was about the best adjudicator that I can recall, that he was always the most helpful in his criticism. Michael Toomey was good. Jack Cruz was indifferent, you know. It wasn't his scene, even though he was a variety man. He certainly didn't have the ability to give a good adjudication from stage. Maybe he gave a good written one later on, but never did a nice one come from stage, you know. He wasn't able to make his points, explain them or back them up. He just looked and saw but didn't say why, that kind of thing.
And as Patsy Sheridan recalls, the adjudicators in a national final sometimes also left a lot to be desired.
Instead of having one adjudicator, they had 6 or 7, and it was only a blackguard putting up 8 or 9 or that, and they're saying, what are you putting up? And looking at them doing that, those people, those 6 people, if they were judges, realise the efforts and the work that all these people put into it from the group, and they just having a blackguard, is it 8 or 9? Am I giving 9? I give them 8, you know. And you could hear this, and I thought that was very sad, especially if you were in a group in the final and you saw these and say, after all we've been doing, they didn't care who won or not.
With the success of Clover's show as his calling card, Michael Grant found himself in much demand as the battle lines were drawn for the 1985 competition. Michael was eventually enticed to Waterford Crystal and brought with him an established team who set about bringing the coveted national title back to the glass. Dando Kelly and Liam Murphy remember Michael's impact at Crystal.
Michael had a youth on his side, I suppose, and he was very determined kind of a fella. He was always willing to learn. If we lost tonight, he'd never crib about it. He'd go back and he'd study why we lost, what did we do wrong and things like that. Myself and Denny were saying the adjudicators robbed us. But Michael Grant was completely different. He was all the time learning and things like that.
And Michael Grant most certainly did think televisually before Tops went to television. He loved having hanging frames and frames within frames and images within frames and shadows and back projections and James Bond themes. And remember a Crystal show that was entirely built around a Seamus Bond theme and stuff like that. They were very televisual before there was a strong history of television, you know.
With entries for the local competition down to just Waterford Crystal and Ratex, 1985 is remembered as a low point in the history of Waterford Tops. It seemed that Tops was gradually dying out over the course of the 80s, and looking back, the reason seems fairly clear.
When things started going pear-shaped in the 80s, with the recession, the companies could not justify putting that money into shows anymore, because there were people being left off right, left and centre. How could it be seen on the one hand to leave off people and then start pumping, you know, 100 grand or whatever it was into a show? Like, I mean, it just wouldn't wash.
The change came in the mid-80s with the industries closing and the depression. Bit of a paradox maybe, but the increased expenditure from groups at that time then in Tops, that it became an elitist thing. And you see, only a certain amount of groups could afford it. And the minute you do that, you've lost that magic that you had, that you were crossing all sides of the social spectrum. And the minute you lost that, I think you lost its magic, you know.
I'm not sure of figures, but when I think about the last show that we did, I think the figures of it would have run a full professional show, not just a bunch of amateurs with a few guest artists paid, or, you know, the spending on everything, including the spending on an orchestra. It was getting huge, absolutely huge. Sets and costumes, you know, buying the best materials, make them. It did burn itself out completely.
The 1985 local final was won by Waterford Crystal, but they failed to make it past the national semi-finals. Mick Brown had the following comment to make in the Munster Express after the national final.
Nowadays, the concept of providing entertainment at purely local level has gradually declined, as witness the fact that in Waterford, where it all began, only 2 teams were willing to enter this year. The little shows with their modest financial budgets are gradually disappearing, in the southeast at any rate, and last night's production by national champions Analogue Devices was an abject lesson in what is expected of competing teams if they hope to achieve the ultimate and television fame.
But as 1986 dawned, for Waterford Crystal and Michael Grant, this ultimate television fame was only just around the corner.
Leaning
on the lamp. Maybe you think I look a tramp.
With a 15-year gap since their 1971 victory in the National Tops final, Waterford Crystal approached the 1986 competition starving for success. Michael Grant and Dando Kelly recall one man's mission to restore Crystal to glory.
There was a guy called Ken Hall in Waterford Crystal, and he said it's time for Waterford to start getting back into the Gaiety after all those great days of the ACEC. And he sent me and Dando Kelly off to London. This was really wonderful. I was watching Les Mis in London in '85 when it was in the Barbican Theatre before it had even opened in the West End.
I remember the very first day he came into the job, he sent for me, and he was a new personnel manager, and he said, "I want you to win Tops of the Town." I said, "What?" He said, "I want you to win Tops of the Town." He said, "I saw you in Limerick last year," he said, "and the show was very good," he said, "but it was badly dressed," he said, "and you missed all these, you have to spend money," he said, "to win a show," he said. And I remember he called me in the next day again. He said, "I'm sending you off to London to see shows." I said, "You'll get me sacked in this job." I said, "I'm happy in Waterford Crystal." I said, "You'll get me sacked." "Not at all," he said. The next day he came in and he had tickets booked for 4 of us to go to London to see shows.
The trip to London inspired a fantastic Waterford Crystal show in 1986, with songs from the hit musical Me and My Girl as an unforgettable centrepiece. Madge Collins remembers she was asked to go on stage with husband Richie in a special role.
The one time we had a row over the Tops was the year 86, and he came back up from the glass. "I have good news for you," he said. I said, "What is?" "I'm doing the Pearly King, and you're doing the Pearly Queen." I said to him, "Can you imagine all the girls up on the gallery and me coming out?" He just couldn't understand it, that I wouldn't get dressed up as a Pearly Queen. That was the only time we ever fought.
Waterford Crystal swept the boards in the 1986 local rounds, and Ken Hall's willingness to go the extra mile was rewarded when the Crystal show reached the national final in the splendidly restored Gaiety Theatre.
By 1986, we had brought in the Malumbies from Clonmel, which was a terrific addition, and who became a great friend and still a great friend to this day, Linda Stewart. We upped the ante and we won the Tops again, but we went on the whole way to the final that year. To be beaten by the very famous Mr. Pat McGann in Limerick, not for the first time. I think we were beaten the year before in the out of the final by him as well.
Since last locking horns with the Waterford team in 1977, Pat McGann had become one of the most feared Tops producers in Ireland. But despite his success, McGann remains modest about his achievements.
Very nice to think that people kind of feared me in that, but however they didn't realise that I probably feared all them just as much. And I think this was the whole nature of the Tops competition, that you just had to kind of, everybody was watching everybody else and that, and learning maybe from everybody else as well. And Waterford were a big centre from Limerick point of view, and that we always kind of dreaded what was going to come out, that it was going to be fantastic, and our aim, I think, was pretty well, especially in those earlier years and even continuing on, was to beat the Waterford shows and that, because they were going to be the best and that.
For the new generation of Waterford Crystal performers, the Gaiety was a nerve-wracking experience, as Gary Power recalls.
My first year in the Gaiety Theatre, which would have been in 86, I will never forget, because you've got to remember you were going out live on television and that curtain was going up whether you were ready or not. And I still remember well, because I had the opening line of that show in 86, which was, "It's not where you start, it's where you finish."
Not where you start, it's where you finish.
And I remember I had to hold my hand out and somebody had to throw a hat at me, and I had to catch the hat, which was then going into a tap routine. I spent nights waking up. Would I leave it fall in front of the millions or thousands of people that were going to be watching on television and on the theatre? Thank God I didn't, but it was so nerve-wracking, and it was magic. I don't honestly ever think that I would have ever experienced any kind of adrenaline like I would have in John Player Tops, ever.
Nerves or no nerves, it was a magical show, but Pat McGann and Verbatim took the honours in a narrowly contested final. Pat remembers a very moving experience after the show.
A really memorable occasion for me at 86, probably more than any other occasion. After the Gaiety performance ended, everybody, both casts, went back to, as guests of John Player, to the Burlington Hotel, and we had a
big huge dinner, and it was all pomp and circumstance, and it was fantastic, and obviously the adrenaline was high with everybody. But the director and the group leaders and a few others would normally be delayed because you'd be getting photographs taken for press and things like that. And I remember arriving into the Burlington, and I can remember the Waterford people, every one of them standing up as I walked in that door. It was the most incredible feeling. Every one of them stood up, cheered me. I think they ended up getting me up on their shoulders, if I'm not mistaken. That's a memory I'll take with me to the bitter end.
Waterford Crystal and Michael Grant licked their wounds after the narrow 1986 defeat and readied themselves for another assault on the national title. This time they chose a far more spectacular show for their centrepiece.
One day more, another day, another destiny, this never-ending road to Calvary. These men who seem to know my crime will surely come a second time.
However, this time there was a spanner in the works, as Denny Corcoran and Nokia, formerly known as Raytex, also chose Les Miserables as a centrepiece. Dando remembers that this wasn't the first time it had happened in Tops, but it was possibly the most high-profile occurrence.
I remember going to see shows, I think, one time. Here I go once again with my suitcase in my hand. It was in 8 shows, one after the other. And you get sick of the song. It's a song I don't like anymore. I used to like it then. But I remember the 8 quarterfinals, or whatever, the 8 shows in the quarterfinals, all sang the same song. And they all came out on the stage with a suitcase in their hand. Here I go once again, and that's what. And the audience used to be the same, oh no, not again, you know. But the 2 years of Les Mis that we did it, and so did Denny did it, but the two were completely different.
And completely different they were, with Crystal using the big chorus numbers such as One Day More and Master of the House, and Nokia opting for poignant solos such as Bring Him Home and Empty Chairs at Empty Tables, sandwiched between spectacular chorus sequences. Adjudicator Jim Bartley had a difficult decision to make on the night, but in the end chose the Crystal Show as winners. In the News and Star, CVK reported that
victory in this, the Silver Jubilee year of the Waterford competition, was only achieved by the narrowest of margins from a magnificent Nokia team, who had given an electrifying performance in the first half of the evening, and which many in the packed audience, Crystal supporters included, considered unbeatable.
Either of the Waterford finalists could have or should have won the national final that year in the Gaiety. It was a controversial result, as one of the 5 adjudicators, Brendan Balfe, marked the Crystal Show very harshly. This allowed an arguably much weaker Cork teachers and students team to take the title. Michael Grant remembers the incident well.
And then he did the more beautiful number. He did Bring Him Home and things like that. And I took a chance on One Day More, and the show was too new as such. And One Day More wasn't as well known. It's now probably the anthem of Les Mis. And in the final that year, Brendan Balfe, and I don't know will you ever get to listen to this interview, but anyway, Brendan, you decided that I used all the wrong songs and that One Day More wasn't popular enough. And that was the end of me that year, or the end of us winning that final. And funnily enough, you know, the next year, and I'm not a bit sour over this, it's just the way things happen, Noel McDonough I think won the Tops for the Dublin show the next year, and the biggest song in their show was One Day More.
Gary Power also feels that the 87 show was hard done by.
You know, in many ways I would have thought the 87 show was a better show in terms of content and in terms of style. You know, there's the old famous saying, we were robbed, but in actual fact, yes, in that circumstances, I would have gone along with anybody that would have said we were robbed, because it was a far, far superior show to Cork teachers. But in 87, I think we felt, well, you know what, I think it was our turn, and it just wasn't. And it was terrible. You felt so bad. I can't explain that feeling to people. I really couldn't put it in words. And people probably listening to this will think that, like, God, is he mad? Or were they all mad at that time? But no, everybody was so committed and dedicated and had worked so hard on this thing. And here you were, you got all the way to the final and you lost it. It's a bit like if we lost a hurling final in Croke Park.
Michael Grant, however, remains philosophical about the whole experience.
I suppose obviously it was very disappointing. First of all, I'd be quite philosophical about it in the sense that it wasn't that important, you know. It was great to be there. It would have crowned it to have won it one of the years. I thought we might have won it in 87, but we didn't. That's it, so be it with life. It's like everything. I just don't think the adjudicator knew some of the numbers we were doing, and you suffer for that sometimes. That's the risk you take. But to show the betters in 87, I would have always felt that we were better. But I mean, how do I know? You know?
An integral part of the 1986 and 1987 Waterford Crystal shows was one Richie Collins, a popular cast member wherever he went. His wife Madge remembers when Michael Grant approached Richie to join the Tops.
Michael Grant now was very good to him. Because he came up to meet me one day. He was idle at the time. I was working. And I have good news and bad news, he said. Oh God, I said, what's wrong? He said, the ESB bill came today. And the good news, he said, Michael Grant called to know that I go into the Clover show. And I said to myself, well, God bless Michael Grant.
Madge remembers Richie appeared in the 1986 final, but unfortunately Richie never made it in 1987.
Sure, he was in the 1986 and 1987. He was at the Beninit and the quarterfinals and that. And then we had, he took bad and brought him into Harkeen on the Wednesday. We were going to Dundalk on the Saturday, the show. And he said to me, I'm getting out, but I said to him, you're not, you know. He said, I'm going to ring Ronnie, he said, and ask her for a ticket for the bus. I'm coming out in the morning. So I rang Dr. McCann, and I said to him, he wants to come out. I said, and you know, he wouldn't be able, I said. And he said, don't worry, he said, I'll fix that up. So they didn't leave him out on Saturday evening. But he was back in on Sunday night then again. He died then on the Monday. And then when we were going to the semi-finals, it's only a fortnight after, and I said, no, I just couldn't take it. You know, I wouldn't be able for it. And then the two lads said, well, we're not going. You know, and they were going to leave the show down if we don't go. So I had to go, but it was all vague. I couldn't remember anything about it. I remember sitting in the opera house and crying, like with the lights out, no one would see you, you know.
Gary Power remembers Richie's death as a terrible loss to every member of the Crystal team.
And I was such a dear friend of Richie Collins, and I remember being on that Gaiety stage when we were singing that powerful piece from Les Mis, One Day More, and I remember punching up in that air because we said that this one is for you, Richie, and by God did we do that with such pride. I mean, literally, if you looked at guys' necks, blood vessels were going to pop.
Travelling by bus to the semi-finals in Cork, the Waterford Crystal cast and crew made an unscheduled stop.
When they were going out to Cork, the lads, like, they called the cast and that, and they stopped in Ballination. They went into the graveyard, the whole lot of them, you know, which I thought was lovely now. Actually, they all missed him, you know. He was a great character.
And Madge takes great comfort from one other precious memory.
I was always glad he made the Gaiety. That was the first time, like, you know.
In 1987, RTE began to broadcast a Best of the Rest type show, with Tip Tops taking to the screens for the first time. Niall O'Flynn remembers.
It was the biggest outside broadcasts next to the Eurovision, you know. The first time it started on television, we took the Gaiety, I think, for Saturday and Sunday, you know. And I mean, that was a mad scramble for RTE to get us all set up and rehearsed and everything. Eventually it evolved that they just said they couldn't do it justice or handle the pressure. So then we used to take the Gaiety for a week. That was all right for the Gaiety because they were getting their week's rent, but it was a fair whack of money to be spending. And it was as a result of that the Tip Tops evolved to try and make use of the earlier part of the week in the theatre and make use of the RT setup as well, you know, because they, you know, they had a huge setup there, technical setup with cameras and sound and lighting and everything, you know.
The Tip Tops took the form of a half-hour show featuring the highlights of the shows that nearly made it. Nokia got their 5 minutes of fame when their Les Miserables scene was broadcast, as was their award-winning mime act from Eddie Cody and the Silent Mics. Paul Corcoran has mixed memories of the day out in the Gaiety.
They picked us up on the bus at Ballybrick at 7 o'clock that morning. the whole cast and crew of the Nokia show, and off we went to Dublin. It was in the month of May, I remember. We went up to Dublin, and we got to the Gaiety. We were supposed to start recording at 11 o'clock, but sure, these things go. It was 4 or 5 o'clock that afternoon before we actually got to do it. But in the meantime, we all went for lunch, and someone said, look, upstairs in the Gaiety there's a beautiful restaurant and you can all have chicken and chips up there at a reduced rate. Oh, that sounds good. So we all went up, we had our chicken and chips and a few pints to wash them down, and went on and recorded the show, and that was great. So we were left Dublin, I suppose, about 9 or 10 o'clock that night. Out the Naas Road, people wanted to stop the bus, and we said, no, we really want to stop the bus. The whole bus got food poisoned. Everybody had the chicken and chips. They thought they were getting a bargain. They got some bargain, all right.
By the mid-1980s, with the pressure of spiralling production costs and the prize of live television exposure, the Tops had become extremely competitive, not just between ever-presents Waterford Crystal and Nokia, but all the different factions involved. For supporters, performers and producers, what was once a friendly rivalry was fast becoming a lot more serious.
In the early days of Tops, there was a very, very friendly rivalry between all the groups. You could have members of the same families in different groups. But as it came improving, the standards kept improving, and the friendly rivalry became hostile rivalry.
It's the nature of people who are in show business to be critical and to be hypercritical and to be bitchy about people and everything else. People were very pointed. You were useless, you were cat, you were terrible, and people did badmouth the opposition because that's in sport all the time. You know, the manager says, you want to hear what they're saying about you, and the other direction says, you're a crowd of wusses, you're pussies, the whole lot of you. Go out there and show them how good you are, you know. That was the nature of it.
I remember meeting Denny Corcoran one night, coming out of a pub in the Glen, and I said to Denny, Denny, I'm sick of all this rivalry, are you? And he said, yes, Michael, I am. I said, so we'll never argue anyway, right? And I think some people store things. Now, competition needs it, right? So it was healthy to a large extent.
It was that serious, and the fighting and arguing between companies would become serious. There would have been bitterness in some areas. We were in this one show against another show, against another show, or against another show. And I think when I went in 82, there might have been 4 or 5 shows in it. So, it was real strong rivalry. To the point that I remember Anne McGrath saying to me, just keep your head down, boy, and get in and do it.
For only the second time since the foundation of Tops 26 years before, 1988 saw no Tops in Waterford. In its absence, local publican Bill Martin, proprietor of the much-loved Hibernian Bar, organised the Heineken Festival. For all the world, a mini Tops.
Bill Martin came and Heineken sponsored it. He asked us, and Town and Country, the Port and Docks, and Dee Lanigan put in the show from the Lisdogan, trying to keep it going. The Town and Country and the St. Paul's Variety Show were in the final, and they won the Town and Country. You know, just to try and keep it going. But Bill tried to build on that, but it fell through again the next year then, because there was too much money involved.
And in the recession-torn Ireland of the late 1980s, money, or the lack of it, was becoming a huge issue for Tops. Entries were falling on a national scale, and if it wasn't until the 1990s that the writing was truly on the wall, John Player Tops was starting to go into decline. But as if to prove that money wasn't everything, the emergence of a small community group from Tramore was a timely reminder of the essential spirit of Tops. Jim O'Sullivan and Noel Kane take up the story.
Myself and Noel Kane started, to be accurate, on the strength probably a few points one night. I had been in a previous Top show in 1984. Noel was involved, had been involved for years in Waterford Crystal, because he worked in Waterford Crystal, and he was a carpenter in Waterford Crystal, and I used to make the sets and backstage stuff with the Crystal, and he was heavily involved for several years. But I know we had a chat one night and said, listen, why don't we get our own show going on Tramore? You know, we said, well, we'll have a look and see, is it possible? And we could put a few queries around, and the feedback was good, would be great. Quite a few people, to be honest with you, did express reservations and said, that'll never happen.
So we looked at the rules and see what was involved, and could we come in, because I didn't know at that time whether or not a community could get involved. The big thing was really with the Tops was it was begin to wane a little bit. You weren't getting the number of shows into it that they would have loved to get in Waterford, and because at the time it was De La Salle and never involved in it, so they wanted more and more shows, you know. So when we put it to them, they said, yeah, no problem, come in, you know.
Tramore made their grand entrance into Tops in 1986, winning the Adjudicator's Special Award. They entered again in 1987 with a show that was improving all the time. Noel Kane remembers that in 1989, when the show needed to step up a further gear, he had a cunning plan.
Denny Corcoran and Dermot Graham had never worked together. And I said to myself, if I could get the two of them involved in this show, because I reckoned the show was made for both of them. You know, it was based on two old thespians that had gone down through the years of doing variety and had finally gone back into time to remember the things that they did. So there was a great scope for doing anything, and end up then in a situation where both of them were died off and they went to heaven, and they did the biggest show of all in heaven, you know. So that was the finale. But Dermot really didn't want to do to get involved, because he owned the Three Swans in Tramore, and he was too busy and he couldn't really do it. But he said he would help out in some of the production bits, but he wouldn't be in the show. So then I thought of Nicky Cummins, because Nicky and Denny were good friends, and Nicky was working in the factory with me, and I asked Nicky would he get involved, and he said he would. And in fairness to him, then we brought Denny in, because Denny, when he saw what we were doing, got so involved. He loved it, you know, because it was what he had done, and he wrote parodies and everything for the show, and he wrote the comedy for the show.
One parody in particular was to see Tops legends Denny Corcoran and Dermot Graham on stage together for the first and only time in the history of Tops.
Do you remember the old times and the days when we were boys?
Denny actually wrote the old times. Do you remember the old times? From himself and Dermot. But Dermot got sick at the time, so I was slotted in. But I think there's a great memoir for me, because we have it on video. Denny has it on video too, that the three of us are together. The two of us sang the song. I remember Dermot was sick at the time, but he came on at the end of the actual song in the local final, while by they tore the house down. So I can see us now, the three of us with the boat of hats on us and the canes. And Dermot done his boo boo boo, which he could do in his own intimate way.
For Denny, it's also a treasured memory.
It was the last time that Dermot was involved in the Tops. To see him on stage with Denny Corcoran, a fella that had broken his heart so many times, but I was proud to be on the stage with Dermot that night.
Old times indeed. And at the end of a turbulent decade in its history, a timely reminder that Tops at its best was a celebration of talent, variety, and above all, entertainment. Noel Kane sums up the 1980s in a nutshell.
Tops of the Town had become semi-professional. I won't say it's professional, semi-professional. We all had to get better at what we did. And we all had to get cuter at what we did. We all had to get, we had to get money as well, and we had to put money into the show. You know, you needed the glitz and glamour, because if you were going to get on in Dublin to a final, it had to be a good. You're up against RT standard type of thing, and RT, although they did it, they weren't too interested in it because it was amateurs. But at the same time, you had to have it good, so that you didn't want to make a show of yourself in Dublin. You know, we had to start thinking that way. We needed the bigger glitz and glamour.
This programme has been part funded by the Broadcasting Commission of Ireland's Sound and Vision Scheme.